Hi, and welcome to Global History with Mrs. bidelSPOT. Today we are going to be looking at civilizations. Specifically, we're going to focus on kind of the first civilizations in general, and moving into Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent area of the world. So when we're doing this today, I've got some guided notes. They're also available for you on the link below. And we are going to kind of go through this. I'm not going to do it completely step by step because I would like you to be able to rewind and rewatch something if you're questioning, like, oh, where did she say that? But everything that's in the packet will get answered and discussed in this video. But again, I'm not going to go and say this is the answer to the first part, although I'm going to start that way, because the first thing on those guided notes is asking what is culture, what is civilization? How do we define it? Well, it's a tough thing to define, but ultimately civilizations are groups of human beings living together with certain advancements that are being made, which go into the five things that make up eight things that make up civilizations and the characteristics of them. Every one of a civilization eventually reaches the goals of the following things. They're going to have social classes. They're going to have social classes. They're going to have a writing style of some variety, some kind of written language, or oral language too, but usually some form of written language. It could be pictorial as well. They work on public works such as roads, not necessarily for automobiles, but some form of movement, or it could be a public sewer system. Those are public works. They have some form of government. It could be a democracy. It could be an oligarchy, which we'll get into. You can watch my lesson on governments later on. They have job specialties, which would mean that the people who are in positions have a specific job. Like here in the world we live in, there are people who are doctors, there are people who are lawyers, there are people who are teachers. Very few people are expected to be all of those things wrapped into one. So job specialty is another one. All civilizations have some kind of belief system. You can call that a religion. It doesn't necessarily have to have a god. That's why I like to use the word belief system instead. A belief system could be a code of ethics, of morals. Many times we're looking, though, at religious sort of things. And all civilizations have a rise of city population, so an urbanization, and all have some kind of achievement in architecture, so some kind of growth as far as how they have created buildings. So the next thing I want to really look at is how societies and cultures interact with other societies and cultures. And there's kind of two main ways that this is done. And one is cultural diffusion, and the other is exocentrism. And cultural diffusion is sharing of cultures. So you have culture A over here, and you have culture B over here, and they end up meeting up and they share things. For example, when Marco Polo, who is Italian, and much later on in your global history curriculum, he's an Italian man, Marco Polo. When he travels to China, okay, he goes from Italy to China. When he gets to China, he discovers noodles, which he takes back and brings to Italy in the form of spaghetti. So that's cultural diffusion. That's the sharing of products. It could be different customs, could be beliefs, could be religion, language, or families as well. And the other one is exocentrism, and that's where you're going to judge one culture based on your belief that you are better than the others. Okay, and then I want to look into the Neolithic Revolution. This is huge. This is the first time when nomads start to become farmers. What the heck is a nomad? Nomad is someone who is moving with the herd or the season. They move around. Some really great examples. I know this is world history, but like our Native Americans here in the United States, like they had teepees and stuff like that, and they followed the buffalo herds. They were nomads. And I'm referring obviously to the Western Native American people. Those are nomads, people who follow and move for food. When people started to farming during the Neolithic Revolution, then they started to farm and domesticate animals, they were able to stay put, okay? Because then they were able to grow things where they are. They didn't have to go and hunt different food sources because they were getting the food sources right to them. I'm like bending down because I didn't think I got plenty of room. Okay, so nomads move around, but during the Neolithic Revolution, they stop moving, they start planting stuff in the ground, and they start domesticating animals. Domestication of animals is referring to kind of taking them in. When we talk about domestic animals, they're like the ones that we keep in our house, like our dogs and our cats. But the animals we're referring to at this point are like cows, chickens, goats and cows and stuff are among some of the first animals domesticated. And we use them. People use those for a food source. Okay. So where did this all start to occur? Well, it starts between two chunks of land, or two bodies of water, I should say, in a chunk of land, and that is referred to as the Fertile Crescent. The Fertile Crescent lies in between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. This is in what is modern-day Iraq, which we will certainly get to, and if you're looking at the guided notes, you'll see a picture. Actually, I can show you here. There is what we're looking at. So this area, I can't do this. This area here is the Fertile Crescent. Now, crescent, if you've heard that word before, you can think of the moon. Okay, that's a really bad version of a crescent moon, that half a chunk of moon. So that's what that's meaning. That's referring to the shape of it. And fertile is referring to that it's life-giving. When you think you're fertile, you think of maybe women who are fertile, able to have children. See, I can sneeze too. So life-giving. So the Fertile Crescent is a life-giving area. Iraq, modern-day Iraq, is known for being a desert area, but this area between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the two main rivers in Iraq, is a fertile crescent. It is able to give life. They do this when people settle around rivers because rivers in themselves are life-giving. We need rivers. Rivers provide us with a water supply, but also in the case of the Tigris and the Euphrates, they also allow for occasional yearly flooding, which then creates rich farmland. And that's one of the reasons why you're going to settle around a river. As you're continuing on with your global history studies, you will actually see that a lot of times people they go to rivers. That's where they're going to go because it allows you to trade, allows you to farm, and we're going to get into a little bit more of that as we continue. So when people started to live in civilizations, live together instead of as nomads, they also had to come up with different ways of which they were going to farm. And one of those was referred to as a slash and burn. And slash and burn is, not necessarily the most environmentally friendly thing. We try to avoid doing it nowadays, but it worked really well. And the idea is that you'd go into a forested area, you chop down all the trees, and you burn them. The burning is essential to this because the burning creates nutrients in the soil with the ash. Ash is actually extremely good for farming. So that created a really fertile area as well in the soil. So they fertilized it with the ash. However, as you can imagine, environmentally, chopping down everything, not the greatest idea. And then the other thing that was becoming really big was irrigation systems. And we don't think much of this because it's kind of common to us that people would have some kind of water method. But as we're talking the Tigris and the Euphrates, if you live in an area that's not right along the Tigris and the Euphrates, you need to get the Tigris and the Euphrates to those people, and that's an irrigation system. That irrigation system, you basically will chop the earth down get into the earth, make a little canal so that the water can go from one side to where you need it to go. Okay, so why would it be important to settle near these rivers? You need the water for the crops because, with the exception of like cactuses, food, actual things you want to eat, don't grow well without water. There are very few things that can survive that are, really yummy and edible without water. And as we've talked about, Mesopotamia is this first area, that's that Tigris and Euphrates, that Fertile Crescent area, and that is between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers in Mesopotamia. And the first village that was settled there, or one of the first, was Sumeria. And the people who lived there were Sumerians. So we're going to talk a little bit about what Sumeria was and what they did there. It's not a country nor a city. It is a city-state, which means that it's a collection of smaller cities, and then they kind of all fall under Sumeria. And historians basically say the Sumerians are the first civilization in the world. Ooh, that's exciting. Yay for them. And they ultimately became led by a man named Sargon the Great, who conquered much of the Mesopotamian area and is known as the first king, really in the world. So he was able to take all these kind of city-states, little chunks of places. You're going to hear that term again, particularly when we get to Rome and Greece city-states. So don't worry too much about it being a vocab word yet, but you'll get there. So he started conquering all these city-states, and he said, I'm in control of all of them. So that's pretty cool. All right, moving on. We want to look at what are some advantages and disadvantages of living in the Fertile Crescent area. We mentioned a few of these before. So you got kind of two things that come with a water problem. So one problem with living in the Fertile Crescent is that there's a water issue. Again, it's modern-day Iraq, which if you've seen anything in modern history about wars there, it's a desert area. So they have those two main rivers. So the Sumerians were able to take advantage of the fact that there was flooding and that there was dry. One time of the year was extremely dry, one time of the year there was like extreme flooding. So the Sumerians said, well, we're going to create that irrigation system that I was talking about before. So a way to get water from point A to point B by chopping the ground down. The other thing was that there was very little defense in the Fertile Crescent, and what I'm referring to is the fact that it's very flat. There's not a lot of mountains to protect the people, so when they created their civilization, they couldn't go, anyone could come into their civilization because there were nomads. It's not like these were the first people. There were nomads. There were people that were still wandering around that could conquer them, so they needed to come up with a way of defense. So they started to create walls, and that was their answer. So they took the mud and they walled in their city. So the other thing too was that they had a limited amount of supplies. So they didn't have a lot of stone, they didn't have a lot of wood, they didn't have a lot of metal. So what they were able to do was start trading with people that did. Again, although they're the first civilization, they're not the first people. So there's all these nomads around. So they started to trade. That was the solution that they came up with. The society, I told you that civilizations have certain kind of things within them, and one of them is religion. And the Sumerians did have a religion. They were polytheistic, and polytheistic means that they believed in many gods. So they didn't have one person they followed. They had many, many, many gods that they worshipped. And they believed that the gods were immortal and they were all powerful. And they had, a couple of main gods. The god of heaven, the god of cloud and air, the gods of water and floods. And the Sumerians believed that in the afterlife, the souls went to the land of no return. It's nice. So they went someplace that was beyond earth and the ancient seas. So they went to the land of no return. One of the other things that I wanted to talk about is who ruled Sumeria. I mentioned that Sargon the Great became ultimately the main king of Sumeria, but there was a hierarchy, meaning a level of which who controlled power. Okay, and in Sumeria, the most powerful people in Sumeria were priests and kings. And then we went down to wealthy people. Which is wealthy merchants. Okay, I'm kind of just going through here real quick. And then we have, on our next level, artisans and farmers. And artisans and farmers, artisans is referring to someone who might have a specific job. So they maybe a pot maker, like someone who makes pots. Okay, that would be an artisan, someone who has a specific job that they do. And then slaves. Okay, and this idea of hierarchy we're going to see throughout global history, that there's the wealthy few at the top and they have the most power, down to a majority of people who there's more of them but they have the least amount of power. So in this case it's the slaves. I do want to remind everyone, when we're referring to slaves, this is not based on race like it was in America. So when we're thinking of slaves, it's not necessarily like an African slave thing. When we're looking at slaves in this context, it's usually someone who was conquered by the person in charge. So in this case, anyone that the Sumerians would have controlled and taken over, they would have taken those people in as slaves. So it doesn't have to do with race like it does. Actually, the African slave trade in the United States and Europe was the only time in history that there is a race-based slave trade. Others was based as like you won them in war. And something to also understand is that women had more rights than they do later on. And I'm referring to the fact that, like, nowadays women are certainly getting more rights than they had for a while, but a lot of civilizations, it took a long, long time for women to gain rights. But the first civilization in Sumeria, in Mesopotamia, the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, had women with lots of rights, which is pretty cool. But it's unfortunate there were steps backwards from there. We are almost done. So the other thing I want to get to, tax. So I want to talk a little bit about what kind of was bringing down this area. I've kind of implied it a little bit, but they got weak and taken over ultimately by attack by other nomadic tribes, or by nomadic tribes because they're not nomadic. So the nomads were coming in, raiding, and attacking them, and it weakened the Sumerian people. As particularly in which the nomads left in complete ruins, and that was the last great city-state of the Sumerian people. There are some important things that also happened in this time in Mesopotamia. One of them was Hammurabi's Code, which was developed around 2000 BC or BCE, which BC would mean before Christ and BCE would mean before Common Era. And Hammurabi's Code was a policy of law, and it was like kind of the first law that had ever been put out there before. And the concept was to really give everyone kind of a strict code of law that you need to follow. And this is taking place in Babylon, which is the capital city of the Armades. And where am I going? And they needed this written law. So they came up with this code of laws called Hammurabi's Code. There are 282 codes in Hammurabi's code. 88 of them deal with marriage, family, and property, and 3 of them have 3 fundamental properties. One is retaliation, which is that you're going to have like a punishment for your crime. This is a very, really, 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 really famous one, the eye for an eye. So if I went and I poked somebody's eye out, my punishment for that would be to have my eye poked out. Then the next one would be to punish people. And there are, we talked about the social classes. You're going to be punished differently depending on where you fall in this list. And the last would be government, and that's the idea that government had the responsibility for what occurred within each society. One of the other important things that comes out of Mesopotamia under the Phoenicians would be the fact that they really come up with purple dye, which is why purple's a royal color, which is made out of snails. Out of snails. It requires 60,000 snails to make purple dye for the ancient patricians. And they develop the first writing system, which is called cuneiform, and our first alphabet was born by these people. So a lot of things come out of the Fertile Crescent, Mesopotamia. So when you're ultimately thinking about kind of an overview of what's going on, and when you're thinking about society and civilizations in general, you want to think about that all civilizations have a writing style. They have social classes, okay, writing style, cuneiform. They do public works, could be a well, could be roads, could be bridges, irrigation systems, and we're in 3. They come up with some form of government, Hammurabi's code in Mesopotamia. They have job specialties like artisans, people who are going to make specific things, like one person is going to be a farmer, one person is going to make bowls and pots. There's going to be a religious belief. We talked about they're polytheistic in Mesopotamia. They believe in many gods. They raise cities like Sumeria that we looked at. And they do some kind of wonderful growing of architecture. They build upon architecture, which I didn't really touch too much about with Mesopotamia, but they have some sort of architectural growth. We've talked about nomads, people who we talked about the Neolithic revolution, that people used to be nomadic and they used to follow their food. And then with the Neolithic revolution, they stopped moving for the food and they started farming and they started domesticating animals. We talked about cultural diffusion, the idea that, you take one culture and that slowly they start to share different things and they each get stronger by having commonality between the two. Talk specifically about the area of the Fertile Crescent in between the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers in what is modern-day Iraq, and about how that is the area that is Mesopotamia. We've talked about different farming techniques such as slash and burn. We've talked about irrigation, digging ditches in the ground to get water from one place of another. We talked about the Sumerians, how they're the first civilization. We've talked about advances and disadvantages of living in the Fertile Crescent and how you kind of make that better. We talked about the different people and how they ruled. Talked about Hammurabi's code, the eye for an eye, the first written set of rules in world history. And we've talked about cuneiform, the first writing style. All right, so I hope, oh my goodness, I forgot a whole section. Don't finish. We want to talk about the Iron Age. So this is huge. There was we were in something called the Bronze Age, where the metal that was used was bronze. The next age up was the Iron Age. Iron is much harder and stronger than bronze is. It goes through a smelting process, which is heated, and then the iron is made stronger. and harder. Iron is actually more common, but you have to heat it and smelt it out, but it becomes easier and cheaper to use once you can get it to that level. And this really allows us to get to the age of empires with the development of iron. Iron is iron is still used today, but they were able to make swords out of it. They were able to use make skillets and dishes and all sorts of great things out of iron. Very, very strong. You can build with it. Still, it's the next step is steel. But this is really helpful stuff. So I forgot to mention that before, but we move into the Iron Age during this birth of civilizations. And that, my friends, is where I'm looking to end with you today. So I hope this was helpful. If you have any questions, please submit them on the comments below. And I hope everyone does really well in school. All right, bye.